Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome back to that annual tradition in which we talk about our best books of the year, our best reads of the year. This is my nonfiction list of 10 books, the 10 best nonfiction books I read. As always, these are not necessarily books that were published in 2022. As a matter of fact, most of them were not published in 2022, but this is the year in which I read them. I'm mainly a backlist reader and not a new release reader, and that would be the reason for that. So I have them ranked in order, 10 being the least favorite of my favorite 10, and number 1 being my most favorite. At number 10, I have The Right to Sex by Amiya Srinivasan. Ms. Srinivasan is a professor at Oxford or Cambridge, I believe, and her book, The Right to Sex, is really a look at the history of kind of second and post-second wave feminism and how they deal with all kinds of issues, including issues involving things like sexual harassment, pornography, whether that pornography is, a good thing for the women's movement or a bad thing for the women's movement, or a good thing or bad thing for women. And it's really a series of essays. The book is a series of essays, kind of all hovering around these same topics. And I found it to be really, really interesting. And that's why it made my list of number 10. There were times at which I really thought the author was not necessarily making the best points, where I wanted the author to, make a point and they didn't, but maybe that's for the best. Maybe it's wiser and a better thing not to have taken, a definitive stand or a clear stand or an oppositional stand to any of the things that the author talked about here in the book. But I thought it was really good. It had a lot of insights, and so I made it my number 10. At number 9, I have the 1619 Project, which was compiled and partially written by Nicole Hannah-Jones. This book is really controversial when it came out in 1919. Many people, in 2019, many people essentially have pointed out historical inaccuracies or historical falsehoods they believe in the book. To be honest with you, most of those just have to do with different interpretation of sets of facts. When the newspaper supplement came out in the New York Times, a group of historians got together and wrote a letter in which they basically called out what they felt were, the inaccuracies in it. Many of those professors later went back and said, well, the letter is worded in a different way than I thought. It's not necessarily about historical inaccuracies. It's about a different interpretation. And I got to be honest with you, that's what history is really all about. This is a book that has multiple authors, and essentially it deals with the history of racism from the beginnings of slavery in 1619 all the way up to the modern times. So it covers not just the era of slavery, but the Jim Crow era, and it covers the era, the post-Jim Crow era. And I really, really thought it was good and thought-provoking. One of the things I think that we have to kind of get away from, and I'm guilty of this too, is the idea that we have to agree with everything in a book of history in order to think and appreciate, or to think that that book is a good book. And this is one of those cases. I agree with almost everything in the book. I do think the book has an agenda, and I got to be honest with you, most history books have an agenda. Even if it's just a biography that's designed to make you think differently about a historical figure, that book has an agenda, and historians have agendas when they write. And number 8, I have a really old book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs, which is a really powerful, moving kind of slave narrative that Harriet Jacobs wrote after she escaped to freedom. And it's all about, the trouble she went through to escape, how the incredibly long period of time she spent waiting to be able to reunite with her children and have her children's freedom, all the things she had to do to escape being captured, how perilous her situation was. It's just really powerful look at, the reality of enslavement for Black people in the United States of America, and things they had to go through, and all the kind of nightmare scenarios that were in place. I just thought it was really great, so I put it on my list here at number 8. At number 7, I have Islands of Abandonment by Cal Flynn. This is an environmental book which really looks at places like islands used for military installations, places where there have been nuclear disasters, places where chemical weapons or chemicals have been dumped. And what Cal Flynn does really, she goes back and looks at how those places, those natural places, regenerate themselves. And I realized that it's optimism about the environment is one of those things that is rare, and it makes you seem kind of like a Pollyanna and a little bit naive. But I do like the idea of, at least maybe even after human beings are gone, that the planet itself will heal itself. And we may not be the beneficiaries of all that, but that capability actually exists. So I put Cal Flynn's book here, Islands of Abandonment, at number 7. At number 6, I put the book I probably spent the longest time reading this year. I think I started it in June, and I didn't finish it until August or maybe September, and that's Africa's World War by Gerard Prunier, who was a journalist who worked in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and he essentially traces the way in which the Rwandan genocide and the rise of Tutsi power in Rwanda and the collapse of the Democratic Republic of Congo's government led to this kind of humanitarian human catastrophe, which many people call the African World War, in which millions of people died, in which multiple African countries took part, and the Democratic Republic of Congo descended into chaos and anarchy and constant violence, and some of the most horrific things took place, and how kind of nightmarishly involved and intricate all the alliances and things like there were. And I thought, Prunier handles that subject impeccably. It is incredibly complex. It was not an easy book to read, but I think a really important book to read, to have some understanding of what went on in Africa during this time period. Africa and what happens in Africa is one of those things that we in the United States of America, and perhaps in the West in general, have a tendency to overlook until some kind of nightmarish thing happens. Well, in this case, a nightmarish thing happened, and most people in the West still overlooked it. At number 5, I have a book that I read this year for NonFiction November, which I just thought was really incredible, and that was Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I've not seen anybody on BookTube who's read this book who didn't think this book was great, and it is so powerful and wonderful, and Kimmerer's writing style is effective. It draws you in. It conveys emotion well. She's able to put you in the positions which she's in, and what she really is doing here is calling for a reassessment of how we as human beings interact with our environment, and suggesting that if we adopted traditional Native American practices and ideas about our place in the environment, our place in the world, and what we should be doing, that the planet and we would benefit. And it's just so beautifully done. Kimmerer is I believe a naturalist, a biologist, and she has incredible in-depth knowledge about plants and all kinds of, it's just an amazing book, how somebody who's that knowledgeable is able to convey the ideas as beautifully and brilliantly as she did. It's just incredible. At number 4, I have The Price of the Ticket. This is a big collection of James Baldwin's essays. It's not all of them, but a big collection of James Baldwin's essays that I read as part of a big group read in February of last year. And I read all the way through it. I think I might have skipped a few at the end. And it is just incredible to read Baldwin's essays. I'm a big fan of Baldwin's fiction and his writing, but reading his essays about race and racism and the United States of America, was just really powerful and incredible. The collection includes, the essays that make up The Fire Next Time, as well as lots of other essays you may or may not have heard about having to do with Baldwin, and it's just great. So I think that Baldwin is just a true American master writer at fiction and nonfiction, public speaking. I'm going to read a collection of his poetry this February, and we'll see how good he is at poetry. At number 3, I have On Juneteenth by Annette Gordon Reed. Annette Gordon Reed is a historian who is famous for writing the book Hemmings's of Monticello, about Jefferson's children and family that he created with one of his female slaves, Sally Hemings. And in this book, instead, the author, Ms. Gordon Reed, reflects on her experience of growing up in Texas in the 1960s and 1970s, and her experience with being as a child integrating an all-white school, her experience of what Juneteenth meant and how that's changed. It's just a really moving, powerful book about the United States history of racism and discrimination, woven together with history of slavery in Texas and the author's personal history. I just found it to be incredibly moving and powerful, and it's also really short. At number 2, I don't think anybody would be surprised to find that these next 2 books are my 1 and 2, and they could have changed order. I've talked about them extensively already on my channel. At number 2 is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, in which Michelle Alexander, I think, effectively makes the case that our turn immediately from ending Jim Crow with the Civil Rights Movement to this kind of law and order politics, and particularly the war on drugs, has led to a new form of government-sponsored racial discrimination, primarily aimed at black men, who end up being the people who are arrested more often than anyone else and imprisoned more often than anyone else for drug-related crimes and other crimes. They're arrested more often. Neighborhoods where black people live are patrolled more often by the police. They're more often charged. They're more often taken to trial. They are, caught in a situation of where plea bargaining seems like the only thing, but then they end up in prison, and then they have a record, and then when they get out, they can't get a job, and so we have the recidivism problem. There are significant issues that Alexander brings to light here that I think are incredibly important to really understand the situation that exists in the United States of America today, understand the reason why we have this large population of African American men and black men in prison, and the impacts that has on the black community, socioeconomically, in terms of crime, the way in which we look at policing these. Anyway, it's just a great, great book and really informative. And the last book I have is my number one. Again, probably not a surprise, is The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. Heather McGhee, in her book, argues that essentially racism and this kind of structural racism we've created in the United States of America damages everyone. That people of all races are actually damaged by this. And I said this before, what she really effectively argues here is that, the United States, we're not playing a zero-sum game. We're not playing a game in which if somebody else gets something, I lose something. She argues effectively, and this I believe to be absolutely true, she argues effectively that really what's happening is that when we bring more people in, we expand more rights, we offer more opportunities, we offer more services, that we all benefit from this. I think I mentioned to you before, the example which struck me closest to home is the example of not expanding Medicare or Medicaid here in Texas, and how that has essentially starved rural hospitals and clinics of money, and record numbers of them are shutting down. And these are clinics and hospitals that primarily serve white rural Texans, and so they're being hurt by this kind of, racist idea that the only beneficiaries of Medicare or any kind of welfare type program are black people, because that's just really not true, and that all of our healthcare costs go up, and that all of us have reduced services. And that's not the only thing, of course, she focuses on the book. That's just the thing which I understood the most clearly, I think, and the one that hit closest to home. Anyway, these were really good books, two really, really great books. If you've read any of them, I look forward to your comments in the comment section below. If you haven't read any of them, I hope that you will. Anyway, thanks as always. Thanks for watching.